Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless. He's over 10 years of experience working with the homeless in Cleveland and has also directed advocacy efforts in the international and local community. He's been working with Witness for Torture for people tortured in our international gulags, and here in Cleveland, the homeless and other oppressed groups in the community. Chris is committed to community organizing, undoing oppressions, and promoting nonviolence that centers the voices of those most impacted by public policy. His work has taken him from the streets of Cleveland to the mountains of Columbia. He's a graduate of McCormick Theological Seminary, and he likes to spend his days boating, fishing, and thinking about how to get the community to love so fiercely that homelessness is unimaginable.
Alright, can I take off my mask?
Sure.
I am vaccinated, but I know that doesn't fully do it. I'm going to try not to use the microphone. I have a pretty loud voice that carries pretty well, so I think I can hold the space through that. I just want to thank you, Stephanie, for the invitation and inviting me here to be with all of you. And I guess I just want to thank all of you. Like St. Malachy's has been such an important, has done such amazing work and important work for people that are experiencing homelessness in our community, and has always been a refuge for so many people. So and that's your work. That's kudos to all of you. And I think, you know, St. Malachy's is understood as a place where people can come and be safe and be welcome for who they are. And so, you know, that's you all, and that's what you do. So I feel like a little bit I'm like preaching to the choir. So, but I really like to kind of take a step back and talk about homelessness as a system, and so we can understand kind of like from step one to the end, like how does the homeless system work for people? And so, and I think it helps us develop a deeper understanding of like what's happening around homelessness, and specifically kind of grounded and framed in our current context of Cuyahoga County, right? So that's kind of what I want to do. But I want you to do it with me, right? I'm not a great lecturer, so we're gonna do this together. And so I think my first question is to all of you is like, why do people become unhoused in our community? And there's no wrong answers. Yeah.
Victims of domestic violence?
DV, yeah, absolutely. If you look at the families that are entering our family shelter, half of them come because they're fleeing domestic violence.
Addictions.
Say that again? Addictions. So how do we understand addictions nowadays?
It's an illness.
It's a disease.
Yeah, so we understand it's so when we talk about addictions, we should couple it with mental health and addiction, right? Is, you know. What else?
Joblessness.
Say that again?
Joblessness.
Job loss, joblessness. I want to press you there and say that, you know, over 40% of people experiencing homelessness have a job in our community. You know, if not higher, sometimes it's 60% that are staying at the men's shelter. So what would that mean? They have a job.
Wages are too low and rent is too high.
Yeah, so then you like hit on two things, right? We talk about low wages, right? Anyone have an idea of a single mom with 2 kids working minimum wage in our community? How many hours a week would they have to work to afford a 2-bedroom apartment? Yeah, the number is section 74, right? So when we talk about homelessness, we often hear like, oh, just go get a job, right? And I like want to push and say like, when you tell someone to go get a job, what you're really saying is like, hey, you should go work 80 hours a week and try to afford your own apartment, which is an impossible feat, right? It's an absolute impossible feat. So
Evictions?
evictions, right? So when we talk about evictions in our community, I'm going to go back to what Stephanie said is also like the price of housing. So I just want to bulk that with affordable housing, right? There's like nowhere in the whole state of Ohio is a minimum wage job able to pay the price of your apartment, right? So, and then evictions, when we look at family homelessness, again, half of them come from domestic violence and the other half is they were removed from their home, majority for non-payment of rent, right? That's the most common eviction practice. So I see one other hand.
LGBTU.
Yeah, right. So, LGBTQ plus young adults. So that, how does, it's, they're estimated to around, I want to say over like 70% of young adults that are currently homeless identify as LGBTQ plus. And so how does that happen, right? Like, let's play that out a minute. So someone comes out to their family sometimes, what do they say?
Get out.
They say get out, right? And they or their family's abusive and other things, right? And we see it almost every day. Where do they go? Well, you go to the street, but most likely they might go to the church community or they might go to other places, and typically what do church communities often say?
Get lost.
Get lost, you're a sinner or we don't accept you, right? And so their network has, because of their identity, has really, so they end up on the streets, right?
And one other thought, just general family dysfunction, not particularly addiction, but people that just don't get together and all of a sudden somebody's out.
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question?
Reasons for homelessness.
What she said.
Oh, she said general family dysfunction, right? I think that's true, but like, I think there's people that have general family dysfunction that don't end up in homelessness, right? So one of the things we've really identified is kind of this, like families, like we call it network poverty, right? Where you're kind of, your whole family, like your family's been prevented from building generational wealth, right? And then you're struggling, but not only you're struggling, your aunt's struggling, your dad's struggling, your grandparents are struggling. And so you have this network that is really, and so when family dysfunction happens in the midst of that, right, there's really no place that's like there to support you in your housing crisis. Yeah.
Well, just that our society commodifies housing just the way we commodify healthcare, and we're so sick because healthcare is a private commodity, and we have homelessness and unstable and unsafe housing because homes are a commodity and not seen as a guaranteed human right. So just the lack of affordable housing overall that has multiple dimensions, and one is that Section 8 vouchers that guarantee rent are available to landlords, but there's too few landlords with decent housing that will accept them. So there's that in the rental area of housing, a lack of affordable housing because landlords refuse to take people with vouchers.
Yeah, so I think we'll get to that, but I'm going to put housing vouchers way over here for now. Anything else? Yeah.
I forgot the reason I was homeless. I ran away from home when I was 16 years old because I was the victim of criminal child abuse, and I drifted in and out of homelessness from the age of 16 to the age of 20. So I think child abuse needs to be on there.
Yeah. I want to take that a little broader because I think you're absolutely right, and I just want to honor your story and thank you for sharing that into the space. I want to say that, like, have folks ever studied trauma here?
Yes.
Yes.
So, like, if we take a step back and say, like, trauma, right, and that functions many ways. So who's, like, the population we hear about is experiencing homelessness all the time? Veterans, right? Particularly combat vets, right? And so I would say trauma, but then we understand it as child abuse, I would say child trauma, and then veterans with PTSD.
I think there's also a piece where maybe it's cultural or just because of the trauma, people don't take care of the Section 8 housing. And don't
Yeah.
know much about
The data shows that actually, like, Section 8 people that damages houses is actually very low. It's actually less than 3% of people that are in Section 8 actually damage a house. So I just want to push back a little and say that, like, I think there's a narrative around there that people have had those experiences and those are real, but oftentimes they're not actually, they don't equate to the data that's out there in our community. And so, you know, I just want to come back to cultural trauma, which I actually think you're adding something on there. It's like how we understand trauma, right? Has anyone heard of adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs test?
Yes.
You know, can anyone say what that was?
It was in a book I read.
Yeah.
Well, isn't the concept, I have a student studying that right now, so I should know more, but just that stuff that happens in child, like trauma, has effects certainly later on in life that we only just starting to appreciate.
Yeah, so nowadays, doctors are beginning, there's a 10 questions that we're asked, right, basically about your childhood experiences, right, and did you have adverse childhood experiences growing up? And what we've seen is that when you say yes to six of those, you have a 70% chance more likely of experiencing homelessness in your life, right? You also have like a 80% chance of getting cancer in your life. You have a 50% chance of developing addiction or a mental health issue, right? So they've been able to really equate how adverse childhood experiences have like long-term effects on individuals, right?
And this happens from infancy, you know, to teenagerhood, you know, it can happen really young, and it affects the brain and how the brain works.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about that when we're working with young adults, and especially LGBTQ young adults, because the way trauma affects the brain, it can really slow down the brain development. So you could actually be working with a 24-year-old, but actually because of the trauma they've experienced, that they're actually functioning at like a 17-year-old level, right? And so that's really important. But then I want to invite us to consider, like, just if you were homeless today, like you became homeless, where would you do?
I would go to a shelter.
You would?
Yeah.
You wouldn't call any of your friends or family to be like,
Oh,
can I stay
yeah.
with you?
Oh, yeah.
Right? That's what you would do first.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
You know, and if you had kids, like, where would you put them in school?
Wherever I was living.
Yeah. And then what would you do next?
I would see what resources are available, you know, like, for food and,
So how would you go find those resources?
I would,
Like in really practical thought.
I would go to like a WIC office.
And what would you do with your kids when you had those WIC office?
It's complicated.
But if you had young kids,
Yeah,
you know,
I have to find a sitter.
you'd find a sitter.
Yeah,
Would
but
you-
I wouldn't have money.
Yeah, you wouldn't have the money, right?
Yeah.
And so what would you do then?
I would ask a friend to trade favors. Maybe I could watch their kids when she needed to go out somewhere, and she could watch my kids when I needed to go out
Sure.
somewhere.
Right? Or you would, you know, one of the things is like, one of the craziest things you know, if you went and try to get a job, right, you may be able to get child care vouchers, but you actually can't get a child care voucher until you work 2 weeks and have a paycheck, right? Because you have to prove that you're working to get child care vouchers, right? And I guess I highlight that to be like, there's this, like when your network's in poverty and you're in crisis, right, there's a toxic stress that, like, you know, it might have been a little bit stressful for you just to answer those questions, right? But that's not even real life, right? Like, we're just making it up. But like, if you think you actually lived through that moment, right, of like, you know, I got to get my kids to school. How am I going to get childcare? You know, my one child was stopped by the police and now is in jail, but I have to pay my rent, and now I have to bail him out, right? And then, you know, but I don't have time because I have to work 72 hours a month, right? And then my sister just experienced homelessness and wants to come live with me, but my landlord said no, it could possibly evict me, right? Like stressful, like toxically stressful. And so when we talk about trauma, like that is a constant trauma, right? And they've said that when people are experiencing that type of toxic stress, that their IQ points lower by 10 points, right? You don't think well when you're stressed out, right? But people are living that every day, you know? And so, like, we've really been thinking about toxic stress and how it ends up in homelessness, right?
One of the studies, if you will, that came out of the insurrection, January 6th, studied people that they studied very often had familial unemployment as children and who were bankruptcy. So we wanted to think that these were just low-class people. But all of these things that you're talking about came to fruition in that insurrection where the anger just mushroomed out. So all of these things that you experience as a child come back to haunt you.
Yeah, and I think I think when you see like, I mean, that comes to haunt them and leads them into an ideology of hate and white supremacy and, beliefs and like, fallacies and stuff. And I mean, I think that, that does come from a place of trauma, right? And it takes a lot of deep work to deconstruct that. I just want to bring us back because I think we're missing one major thing before I move on.
Ill health,
Say that again?
ill health, poor health.
Yeah, I mean, healthcare and poor health is definitely another one, but that's not what I'm trying to get at.
Well, come on, tell us.
Tell us,
Chris.
yeah.
No, you all know it.
For a lot of people, having been part of the mass incarceration system, having a criminal
Yeah.
record,
It's a re-entry.
But if we take a step back, like, what is causing mass incarceration? Why do we lock up black and brown people at a systematically disproportional rate? Racism, right? Structural and systemic racism. How do people build wealth in our community?
Buy houses.
You own property, right? And who is systematically prevented from owning property?
Black
People of color.
People of color, right? How did that happen?
redlining.
Caste system.
Caste
That
system,
book-
that's,
That book is great.
and
Yes.
it's,
I
she's coming to
haven't-
speak in Cleveland.
Really?
Isabel Wilkinson for the city clubs, no, for the Cleveland Foundation's gathering.
Really?
Yeah. This is interesting because has anyone read her other book, The Worth of Other Sons? Do you know what it's about? So it's really like a historical narrative around the Great Migration up to the north. And if you take a map of the Great Migration and you put on top of that the largest eviction areas in the United States, it follows the Great Migration exactly. So racism, right? So redlining, right? Like anything else? Blockbusting.
I was wondering about immigration status.
Yeah, I think similar immigration status.
Restricted covenants.
Restricted covenants, right?
That prevent a property to be sold to black people. They're
Yeah.
still on the books here in Ohio, and there's legislation to get it off the books.
So there's a study of Jesuit priests, which you all will appreciate, did a study out of Chicago, right? And so when redlining and blockbusting and race, they're, the way, so people of color, black people specifically, did not have access to banks to buy loans to own houses, right? So how did they get money? How did they buy houses? Because some folks bought houses.
Land contract?
Land contracts, right? And so so the white owners of the house would sign the land contract with the black tenant, right? And they would say that over 30 years, if you pay me this much money every month, you will own this house, right? Those land contracts also said that if you miss one payment after year 15, this contract is null, right? And so this study out of Chicago looked at Chicago alone by this Jesuit priest and figured out that $30 billion worth of wealth was taken from the black community through land contracts alone in Chicago.
Just in one city.
Yeah. So when we talk about like structural racism, it's mass incarcerations for sure, but it's like the history and legacy of like wealth building that has systematically been prevented. So it's no wonder when we talk about the shelter system that 85% of the people entering the system are black in our community, right? And it's because of this, right? Structural racism. Like, you know, well, if you look at the numbers, right, the amount of poor white people like that are living on less than $2 a day, it's the actual disparity starts right there, right? Like white people don't, at that level of poverty, don't enter into the shelter system. It ends up being black people. And so, you know, and we can trace this a little bit further in that we did a study that we looked at Section 8, property-based Section 8 housing, right? And so there's two types of Section 8, right? One's the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which Brian was talking about, which is you get a voucher, you could take it to a private landlord and they will rent to you, right? There's also Section 8 that's property-based where the subsidy is with the unit, right? So you apply to live in that unit and you pay 30% of your income, right? Because that's what people should be paying on housing, right? 30% of your income. So we did a study in Cuyahoga County alone that 80% of those properties had a screening process where they looked back the lifetime and they had a lifetime look back period to prevent people from lying there for misdemeanors alone in their record. Not felonies, misdemeanors, right? And so in 1980s, right, if you were struggling with an addiction and you know, got caught smoking crack and pled down to a misdemeanor, and this happens like with our folks all the time, they go to apply to live in property-based Section 8, and they're like, yeah, like we can't live here because you had a misdemeanor back in the 1980s. Huh?
That's crazy.
It is crazy, right?
That's not just.
So, yeah, like it's absolutely insane, and that is what happens in Cuyahoga County, right?
And then I have a brother who is disabled by a serious mental illness who spent 18 years in prison, and he's having trouble getting supportive help.
Absolutely, he's having trouble.
He's on disability, you know, and having trouble because of that.
Yeah. So let's talk about the shelter system, right? So we talked about why people become homeless. What happens when you become homeless in our community really quick, right? So our community, we have a housing first coordinated entry approach, right? And so what that means is that when someone becomes homeless in our community, we ask them to call coordinated entry, right? And coordinated entry is mandated by HUD in these communities, and that so everyone that enters into the shelter system should get a screening at coordinated entry, right? And there's about, I think it's 6,000 people call or enter into coordinated entry every year, right? But we all know that there's people that don't go to shelters, right? So when we, like our work at the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless is like street outreach work, working with people that are living unsheltered in our community, right? So if we look at what we know from last month, that we knew by name that there was 175 people sleeping outside on the streets of Cleveland. We knew them by name, right? I would say that's probably around 35%, if I was 35% of the actual people that are unsheltered, right? But we know them by name. So for data purposes, like it's helpful to have like a number and track it over the course of a long period of time. You know, so we could say maybe 500 people are sleeping outside. And then there's the City Mission, which is another shelter that you don't have to go through coordinated entry to go into. And then, you know, there's the seasonal shelter with Metanoia. And so these are kind of outside of the continuum, but like just if you want to go to 2100, you kind of go through coordinated entry, right? And so we have a large men's shelter, the largest men's shelter in the state of Ohio. It's 2100. It's run by Lutheran Metropolitan Ministries. We have Norma Her, which is the women's shelter in our community run by the YWCA. And we have a family shelter system, right? And the family shelter system has 3 different shelters. Our family shelter is very different because of the unique. We have the Zelma George, and then we have the Westside Catholic Center runs the family shelter beyond their drop-in center. And then we have Family Promise. Right? So when we think of like the shelter system, this is like where we're talking about, right? Any given night, there's around 2,000 people that are living within the shelter system in Cleveland, in Cuyahoga County, right? That would be the number. But we also know that like when HUD defines homelessness, you are not defined homeless by HUD, the Housing and Urban Development at the federal level, until you come into the system, right? But like you told us when you were becoming homeless, what would you have done first? Well, until I reminded you should call your friends and family, right? Right, so you're not homeless, according to HUD.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So what in practicality that means is that you don't get any of the resources here to get out of your homelessness because you're still doubled up with your family and friends, right? So we kind of estimate that probably if you count, which this is interesting, the Department of Education would consider you homeless, so your kids would have access to the McKinley-Vento Act stuff, which they could have the right to always go to their school where they came from and stuff like that. But the Department of Education says you're homeless, but they don't have a lot of housing resources, right? But HUD does not until you enter the system. Yeah.
Where is the central entry?
It's Bishop Cosgrove Center,
Oh, okay.
downtown, right? Frontline Services runs it. It's the second and third floor of the Bishop Cosgrove Center.
That's the other problem my brother's facing. One of my daughters took him in while we were gonna go through this process of trying to get him supported housing. And that's one of the problems too, because he's, couch surfing at my daughter's house.
Yeah, so he would never access the resources that are designated for the shelter system. He could still get HUD property-based Section 8 and a housing choice voucher.
Okay.
Because that's a welcome to the whole community based on an income level,
Okay.
not your status of homelessness.
Oh, okay.
Any questions around this? Yeah.
Yes, two things. One, about 10 minutes ago, you said they might have to work 72 hours a month, but it's really 72 hours a week is what you meant. I just want to clarify that. Secondly, wouldn't one want to get the street card if they were homeless, the street card that NEOCH offers?
Yeah, so Northeast Ohio Coalition publishes a street card that I didn't bring today because I didn't want to drive to my office this morning. I wanted to spend time with my kids. I apologize. But we have a street card that's basically a card you can give to someone and it can tell them where all the services are, So something to understand about our shelter system, right? We are what we call a housing first community, right? And so that means that there should be no barriers to housing, right? So when we think about transitional housing, you probably heard that before. So a while ago, the HUD decided that is not the best practices of homelessness, right? People should be able to access housing, and homelessness should be brief and short, brief, and non-reoccurring, right? And that we should, from here, just get people directly into housing, right? There shouldn't be a transition period that people have to go through. And so our system is made like that. What that means is that you have emergency shelters, right? And then you have housing, right? And people should get directly into housing. What that also means is that you don't have case management or drug addiction treatment or mental health stuff inside our shelter system, right? Their job is to provide emergency shelter and emergency shelter only, right? That's it, right? You refer everything else out, right? So we have recovery resources, we have the centers, we have frontline services, we have these things, but they are referred out and they're in the community, right? The job of the shelter system is to provide emergency shelter, safe, accessible emergency shelter in our community, nothing else.
Seems to me that some of the people that are homeless are not that functional to go from a shelter into housing and get themselves to their counselor within 2 weeks or what other resources are out in the community. I don't think they're together enough a lot of times to organize organize themselves and get to an appointment or get to a certain location that they forgot the piece of paper that had the address on it. And so then they don't make it. So then they're lost in the shuffle, and then bad things will happen again, and they'll be back in the shelter.
Or they just never get out of the shelter. I mean, I think that's part of the critique, right? They did come up with a whole system to try to cover that, and that's called permanent supportive housing. Has anyone ever heard of that?
Yeah.
So it's kind of, the acronym is PSH, it means permanent supportive housing. We have 867 units of permanent supportive housing in our community, right? And so to access a permanent supportive housing unit in our community, you have to be homeless for 365 days. You have to be diagnosed with a mental illness or an addiction. If you have HIV, you can also get, there's a set of vouchers that designates you specifically for PSH. Or you have to have 3 episodes of homelessness in 4 years that equal 365 days, right? And then when you meet that definition, you get placed on a waiting list to get into permanent supportive housing.
That's not very many thousand. 861 is inadequate.
Say that again?
The 861 is woefully inadequate.
Yeah, I would agree with you, though the county might say like it's based on this definition, the amount of people that are meeting this definition, and the amount of people on a given year, and the amount of people that are leaving PSH on a given year would still allow a unit to be opened up for people. I don't think it happens that way, that's what they tell you. They also, I mean, this is the diabolical thing, right? They also evict enough people out of PSH buildings back to the shelter to let new people go in.
Oh my God.
I mean,
So they misbehave based on their mental health situation, forgot to take their medicine for a month, and then they end up back into the shelter.
well, it wouldn't be based on their mental health. It would be that your mental health has prevented you from paying your rent, or your addiction has prevented, same thing, has prevented you from paying your rent. So therefore, you haven't paid rent in the last 3 months. So therefore, we file an eviction for you. Right? There's also behavior issues that happen inside buildings, right? When you're working with people, like you don't have to get any mental health treatment, right, to get into these buildings, which I think is a good thing.
Well, what's the support in permanent supportive housing?
Yeah. So they have case man. So these are buildings, right? I don't know. There's a lot of them around. You might see them. There's 2 new ones that are up on 25th by the zoo on the left, right before you go over the bridge. There's another one by the old Horizon School, closer to Ohio City. So each place has a case management system, right? Frontline Services runs the case management in the building. So the idea would be each person living there would be connected to a service coordinator and a case manager.
How long is the wait list to get in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's currently like 365 people that are waiting to get on the list. I think like 90 of them have been prioritized to be going quicker than others. Because of COVID, it's been, 2 things, right? It was really quick because of COVID because they opened a new building, right? So a lot of people got into those really quickly, and now it's like no one's moving. So it's a really long wait list to be able to get into those buildings, right? But they also have, scattered site vouchers, which is similar to this. If you meet that, you can get a scattered site, which means you go to the private market, right? So we have the private market. I forgot to say something here. You have to be a single adult.
A single adult. Oh, so families can't get this.
Families cannot get this, no. So for families, we have something we call rapid rehousing, right? And rapid rehousing is a voucher that comes with support that you take to the private market. And you find housing in the private market, right? So I have, the voucher says I will pay your rent for 12 months, and in those 12 months should be enough for you to be able to get a job, take care of yourself, and get a job that you could afford your rent, right?
Do enough landlords accept those vouchers?
No, we'll get to that. I just want to say a couple things. So under COVID, because I think my talk is like
Yeah,
what happened
how
under
did
COVID.
COVID?
So what happened was, look, early on is so our community decongregated shelters, right? I mean, right, I would say in general, the mass warehousing of human beings in large places is not the way we should treat our fellow, you know, people made in the image of God, right? But under COVID, we started putting people into hotels, right? So there was a huge hotel hub strategy where 2100 was deconcentrated by half, and half the people stayed in hotels over COVID. Norma Hurd did the same. The family shelters already decongregated, so you didn't need to do hotels. They used some hotels, but it wasn't the main strategy. And the shelter systems opened up 24/7, right? You could stay there. Because one of the things we saw is that our traditional kind of like drop-in centers, like the Westside Catholic Center and the Bishop Cosgrove Center, like really closed down during, they served meals to go, but they didn't allow people to come in and like hang out like they typically do. And so the response was also that like the shelter system allowed people to stay there and could stay in their hotels and in the shelter 24/7. I mean, people also left and hung out, but like, nothing was open. Even still today, like everything's still a to-go meal in our community. I'm not sure how you did it here with your meal site. Do you have a meal site here?
To
Or
go out the back door.
Yeah, to go out the back. So that's a good example, right?
But it was closed down for a while.
Yeah. Now, like, so these hotels are closing down, and they're putting some housing incentives in place for people to try to get them to go live with family and friends. They're like, we'll give you $600 if you can go stay with your family and friends, rather than come to the shelter. And I think our strategy worked well. Like, we had a very low positivity rate in shelters. Even now with Delta, kind of like there's been less than 5% positivity rate inside the shelter system. There is a COVID positive shelter at a hotel for people that got COVID, could go to the hotel, recover, and then, ended up going back to emergency shelter.
Is every person tested when they come into the shelter? Is that
So not when they come into the shelter. So it's really careful, right? Like you don't want to put any barrier, you want low barrier shelters, right? And what that means is you want to keep the ability to access shelter as low as possible, right? So what that means is you can come in, they do tests there once a week. They do mass testing. They did mass vaccinations in the shelters also. But there's also, I think one of the things that was really helpful with the hotels is like so many people, there's a lot of people that won't go to these larger shelters, right? I think you get a lot of those folks that hang out around St. Malachi's actually, right? We have our outreach worker comes here every Wednesday morning from 8 till noon and just hangs out with people and tries to connect them to services. And so our work partners a lot with your work in the Malachi Center. But we were able to get a lot of people off the streets in the middle of COVID. And then, now I think for last winter it was really helpful. We had a seasonal shelter and stuff. But, now we're seeing that people are coming out of shelter and coming back to camping again, And I think we're really worried about as the hotel strategy ends, based on the county's, they want to end it, like we're going to see more and more people come and be unsheltered in our community.
So, if Delta makes everything go real bad again, there still COVID funds available from the county to put these people back in hotels again?
I don't know. There's not a lot of CARES Act funding left in our community, which is the money that's specifically designated as the COVID relief funds, right?
Yeah.
There is the American Rescue Plan dollars that are entering our community, and I think those could be really helpful and might have to be utilized for that. But those dollars have really been allocated to like rebuild these shelter systems to make them decongregated permanently. So those dollars are really bent towards capital and infrastructure stuff. And so I think the long-term plan coming out of the county is 2,100 will end up being decongregated, the women's shelter would be decongregated, and the family shelters are already totally decongregated.
Well, that's wonderful. And so, but they would still be temporary, not permanent shelter?
They would be emergency shelter.
Okay.
They would not be permanent.
Okay.
But I want to go back to this. So rapid rehousing, right? So, let me know if I'm going too long. You don't want to leave. I can wrap it up. But I just want to go back. So when we talk about housing vouchers, right? And I think this is something we've seen that is actually like why people are staying homelessness as long as they are. Does anyone know? Or maybe there's a lawyer here that knows fair housing law, like who are protected classes that can't be denied housing? I bet we could try to. So who is a protected class?
Black people?
So you're protected by race, right? You can't say I'm not gonna rent to people of color, right? Who else?
Gender? Women?
Gender identity and sexual orientation, at least in Cuyahoga County it is.
How about age?
Age? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. What else?
Religion?
Religion, right? You can't be like, I don't want to rent to Catholics. You know, no one says that anymore, but you know, it's mostly like right? Islamophobia has been like, I don't want to rent to Muslims, right? That's what you hear. But religion.
What about ability or disability?
Yeah, disability, right? You can't deny housing based on disability. What else?
National origin.
Well, yeah, race. I think it's ethnicity and national origin. I think that falls under race, actually.
Not necessarily.
Yeah. Okay.
So what did you say, citizenship status? Like
No,
if they're a non-citizen?
That is not a protected class.
That's not?
No. In
So
fact,
they-
you can't hire undocumented people to work, so it's like encouraged that you discriminate
Well,
against
a
them.
place to live, I mean, that's a human right.
No, it's a commodity in our country.
Oh.
What else? There's one that probably most people don't know. Familiar status. So familiar status. You can't do that if you have a kid, I won't rent to you, that's illegal, right? This is said, not that this happens, or that, like these are protected classes, right? What don't you see up here? Maybe things we've seen here.
Mental health?
No, it'd be disability. Veterans, that's actually a really good one. Veterans are a protected class in the state of Ohio. So what are not protections in our community are, you can,
Incarceration?
criminal records, right? You can screen people for criminal records.
And your credit report, your credit rating.
Yeah, credit is one. Your source of income. So source of income is the big thing, right? So right now in Cuyahoga County, people, you have, how many people have ever seen a sign or something that says no Section 8 here, right? So, so landlords are allowed to say, I'm not to discriminate against any of those, but I'm not going to allow people with criminal records or people that are using vouchers to live in my tenants, right? And so it's interesting because CMHA is currently going to get 235 vouchers for people experiencing homelessness that will be asked to be used in the private market, right? And so landlords, people will get those vouchers and they'll go look out and they'll start applying to houses, right? And they will encounter that. This is exactly what they encounter. I don't accept Eden and I don't accept Section 8, and so you can't rent here.
Is the housing when they go out to look for it, does it have to be approved by HUD or something?
It has to be, the housing has to be inspected by a property management company to deem that it's not in total ill repair, right?
Chris, so I have no rent. And I do appreciate all this information because it helps me get a sense of the system and how fragile it is and all the work that you're doing. I guess my question is, what can St. Malachy's do, particularly the parish, as opposed to the center? And what is it that you would like to see more of from the community?
Yeah. A little bit, I would say something probably a little bit different here is, like advocacy wise, right? Like I think there will be in our community a really strong push to make source of income, to make source of income a protected class in our community, right? In the next 6 months to a year. And like, how can the parish support those efforts because the county, because actually South Euclid, Cleveland Heights, and University Heights all have source of income on their books as a protected class, right? Cleveland, Cuyahoga County doesn't. So when we're thinking about moving, when people have a housing choice voucher, they could move to Avon Lake, right? And their kids would have access to the Avon Lake schools and all that entails for them. But they need to be able to use those vouchers in those neighborhoods, right? And so I think on that, things like stay tuned, follow that stuff, right? I would say like you're in Ohio City, right? Like this is a community that has been built to serve people that are targeted and marginalized in our community, right? And like, you know, hold that legacy, like as everything changes around, I mean, you know this, right? You can see it, everything changes around you. Like how will St. Malachy continue to both be a place that is going to welcome, you know, the people that don't have housing in your parish and in your community and on your property, and how to do that when the forces, everything on the forces around you will say, don't do it, right? And how to like be very clear in your commitment to the gospel to do that, right? I don't know what's happening, but I could guess that there's a push to be like, you know, I mean, they're building a huge hotel next door to you now, right?
Yeah.
Or like everything, right? And like, this place has been a sacred space for people that are experiencing a housing crisis just forever, right? And how to keep it that way would be my ask to the parish, right? And that you all would make sure that happens in the face of, you know, unbridled housing as a commodity around you.
Well, I think we've discussed this, and I think it's, we're trying to make ourselves attractive to these new, you know, neighbors. Look at us, we're doing what Jesus commanded us to do, you know, serving the homeless, the poor, the naked, the hungry, you know, to attract them to join us in our purpose of you know, doing what Jesus said to do, Matthew 25. So that was one of the strategies we were discussing on how we're going to handle the new neighbors. Well, make St. Malachy's the place they want to be, helping with our mission, you know, ministry.
Yeah, I mean, a church is invitational at its core, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, John Paul. We missed you at the council meeting.
Doing just fine.
So is this something that's gonna, this source of income, or opportunities to advocate for this? Is this like getting a hearing in county council or anything,
No, county council refused to look at it. The city council was gonna hear it and look at it, but their elections are happening, right? So it feels really hard to
So
move
should we
anything.
do this at the city level, county level, both?
I think you should stay tuned and let me connect with you when there's the advocacy push that
Thank
makes
you.
sense, right? I just want to go back to here that like, to finish this up is like, and then criminal convictions, right? And so when we think about like, if the major way to get out of homelessness is to use a voucher, like our system, you know, that has, supports a voucher and, you know, to get into the private market, right, to rent housing there. But we know landlords can basically discriminate against criminal history, right? And we have a system that disproportionately targets people of color in our community and unfairly puts them into the criminal justice system. And that they're, like we see how like structural racism plays such still today, like the legacy of all of that still is impacting people to get housing, right? And so when we think about, you know, how do we get people out of homelessness, like treating people's mental illness and addiction is really important, right? And they should do that. But what's preventing people from getting housing are these systemic issues, right? It's not, and I do think there's a lack of access to mental health care in communities, right? No doubt. But these are, for our analysis, these are core reasons why, and they all come back to like how we understand racism, like structural issues in our community, you know?
I'm going back to what we were talking about before for now. You said that somebody comes here on Wednesdays to talk to our guys.
Yeah, Dennis Ashton.
Okay. Back in the day, I would see, I thought it was county social workers come and talk to people. Do you have any idea if they still come a couple of times a week?
I have no idea. I know we have our outreach worker here once a week, if not twice sometimes. But
Jim Schluck come over here anymore?
well, no, Jim Schleck, actually Jim works at NEOC,
Okay.
and then, so Jim is doing something else, and then Dennis Ashton, our other outreach worker is now coming here. So it was just like a rotation. But Jim comes over here a lot.
I just, sorry, when I'm personally engaged in our work.
Yeah, that's awesome.
There is a segment of the homeless that do not want to be put in housing. We would work with people and they formed such a community under the bridge or wherever it was that they didn't want to leave them. But they had the resources in the community. They could get a meal every day of the week on the west side. And they got other resources. And they would go by our windows with all the tin cans.
Yeah.
So, you know, we worked with them, but they just did not want to change their community. So that's happened too.
Yeah, my experience is that in our experience, like doing outreach under the bridge, right, is that most people will take housing when it's accessible to them. That like it's an unfair ask to ask Joe, who lives under the bridge, to spend 90% of his income to get an apartment and move into an apartment.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, when you're considering like the going rent, right, like in Ohio City, right, or anywhere, and someone's getting $850 a month, right? Like they're being asked to move away from their communities. They're asking to pay 90%, 95% of their money to cover their housing costs, which leaves them absolutely nothing, right? And so I think, yeah, some people have like really struggled with like accepting housing based on those parameters. And I can't blame them, right? I mean, it's a hard choice to give up everything you have that gives you freedom to have an apartment.
Sorry. Out of mental health and chemical treatment centers, is there a direct line to housing for those people, or do they end up in 2100?
Yeah, there is actually, so there's Whitehaven, which actually has what we call the golden ticket in this work, is that they have a direct line to CMHA from Whitehaven. And that's the only place out of drug treatment that actually has that in our community.
Not Talbot or anybody?
No, Matt Talbert or any of those places don't have that.
Now, do you guys have a direct line into treatment centers?
Yeah. Or detox and then treatment. So a lot of times we'll get folks from under the bridges or on the streets into detox. You do your detox thing and then you can get into Whitehaven or Matt Talbert. So yeah.
Is that it?
So that's what I have. I don't know. I hope that was helpful and
I am so grateful. Thank you. So how can we get, like on a list for NEOC for when you put a call out for us to show up for advocacy, Chris?
Yeah, if you can send, Stephanie, maybe you could send me people's email addresses if you have them.
And create a list?
And I can put them on. We have an advocacy list that we can send out to.
Okay, you guys, let me get.
And thank you for the donation.
Email addresses for Chris, so I can send it to Chris.